Joining us now on the line from Washington, D.C., Dan Pink. He is former chief speechwriter for Vice President Al Gore and the author of Drive, the Surprising Truth of What Motivates Us. Dan, how are you doing tonight?
I'm very good. How are you doing?
Excellent. Glad to have you on the program. I want to start by reading something that was written in something called the Principles of Scientific Management. And it says, work consists mainly of simple, not particularly interesting tasks. The only way to get people to do them is to incentivize them properly and monitor them carefully. Now, that was written in 1911. Does this business model of motivation still work today?
It works for things that remain simple and uninteresting. The problem is that throughout North America, most work is not that way. And the truth is that if you go back and look at the actual science of human motivation, it will tell you that for things that require even a smidge more complexity, conceptual thinking, creativity, those kinds of motivators, those scientific management motivators, carrots and sticks, if you do this, then you get that, they don't work very well for the sorts of things that most people in the workplace are doing today. And we need a very different approach to motivation, one that is slightly upgraded from 1911, which actually has its roots in the 1850s.
Well, go into that a little bit if you would. What does the research say about the effectiveness of that kind of approach?
Yeah, well, what it says pretty clearly is that if you want people to do things that are simple, straightforward, following a set of rules, following a recipe, getting a right answer, the classic kind of motivator we use in organizations, these if-then motivators. If you do this, then you get that. They work really well for simple things, adding up columns of figures, stuffing envelopes, turning the same screw the same way. But the science is equally clear that once you ask people to do more complicated things, things that require judgment, creativity, those kinds of if-then motivators just don't work very well. They narrow people's focus when you want them to have an expansive focus. They make people short-term when you want them to be thinking long-term. And what the science shows us works better, and what's being reflected in some of the best practices of companies, not only in North America, but around the world, is paying people enough money, but giving them enormous amounts, sometimes enormous amounts of autonomy over what they actually do and how they do it, putting people into positions where they can get better at something that matters, and plugging in people to something larger than themselves so they see what they do each day contributes to a larger whole. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And what's very clear, at least from the research, and I think what's very clear from some of the best performing companies out there today, is that autonomy, mastery, and purpose are just more effective than this endless arsenal of carrots and sticks.
I appreciate that would be the case in an advanced industrialized society, but would that also be the case, for example, in third world countries?
Yes and no. I mean, what's interesting about that is that, again, this book and my argument is not a kind of kumbaya, let's link arms and be touchy-feely, and, it's really rooted in the science. And the science is clear that for the simple stuff, the if-then motivators work pretty well. That said, there are ways to take those kinds of simple, more routine work and give people opportunities to sculpt their jobs a little bit more, make them a little bit more autonomous. That leads to better performance. For simple, routine tasks, acknowledging that what they're doing isn't very interesting, but explaining how what they do contributes to a larger whole can have a big uplift in performance. And so, one of the things that comes out in the research on motivation is really the nature of what it is to be a human being. Human beings are not simply, two-legged, better-smelling donkeys. That is, we have other kinds of drives and other kinds of motivators beyond simple carrots and sticks. And no matter what our station in life is, we have the desire to, have control, have a sense of self-direction. This is why people mass in the streets of Cairo. We have a desire to get better at things that matter. This is why people around the world play musical instruments on the weekend, even though it doesn't make them any money. And we also want to know how we fit in and how we contribute. And so I think that by the nature of what people are doing today on the job, that treating them a little bit more like human beings and a little bit less like donkeys is not only nicer and kinder, it's actually demonstrably more effective.
Let's go for, I guess, we're in the province of Ontario here. We like to think we're the #1 auto manufacturing jurisdiction in North America, which I think, according to the last stats, we are. So let's take an example. Where do you find the autonomy, the joy, the creativity in being on an assembly line and, putting a piece of windshield into a car over and over and over and over? Where's the incentive in that situation?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think on that kind of work that you do have to pay people enough, and that's true for everything. That is, you can't say, hey, I'm going to give you some autonomy and intrinsic motivation in exchange for paying you fairly. That's not going to work. So you got to pay people fairly. But I think that one of the things that you see, say, in lean manufacturing, which actually helped revitalize certainly the American auto industry, is that autonomy is important in those kinds of work, in that kind of work. So that even if some of what you're doing is routine, that the ability to say, if you see a defect, for any person on the line to stop the line and say, hey, I saw a defect, is incredibly important, both in terms of satisfaction, but also in terms of the quality of the output. One of the other things that you see in some kind of approaches to manufacturing is people in some ways kind of signing their work in a sense. Like a byline of someone who wrote an article for a newspaper or magazine. So you say, well, wait a second, this is my work, and this contributes to the larger whole. The other thing that's very important in that kind of work is allowing people to get better at something. Having somebody put the same windshield on in the same way over and over again is part, in a day or a week or a month or even a year, is part of what it means to be productive. But if that's all that person is doing year after year after year, that person is going to stagnate. And so increasing the level of challenge, giving people a little bit more say, allowing them to see how they contribute can be extraordinarily valuable in any kind of undertaking.
I don't want to be cliched about this because I imagine for a lot of people, going to a job on what you would call Wall Street, what we would call Bay Street in Canada, where you're looking into a computer all day long and trying to, make the best trades of companies. That might also be mind-numbingly dull and boring for a whole bunch of people. Where do you find the autonomy, the joy, all of that in that kind of a circumstance?
It could be. I think actually trading is a very, very interesting example of this, because one of the things about, again, we talk about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And mastery is our desire to get better at things. And the way we get better at things is by getting feedback on what we do. And in many cases, whether it's that's assembly line in Ontario or a large, say, bank or insurance company in Toronto, the way that we give people feedback is through annual performance reviews. All right, that's just an insane way to give people feedback. You can't get better at something if you get feedback on your performance once a year, especially in a kind of awkward kabuki theater style meeting with your boss. I think where those traders on Bay Street or Wall Street get a sense of motivation is that the act of trading gets you very rich, rapid feedback. You buy or sell something, whether you did a good job or not. It's very much, in some ways, like a game. And so for traders, their jobs, if you talk to them, they really can get in the moment. They really can get a sense of flow because they're getting very rich, rapid feedback on how they're doing throughout the day in a way that a lot of us in a traditional kind of job don't. In fact, in many ways, the traditional kind, the person working in a financial institution who's not a trader is working in many cases in a feedback desert. They're getting feedback very infrequently. They're getting feedback that isn't deep or rich. They're getting feedback that isn't meaningful. And I think that there are ways out there to enrich the feedback environment at work, which is can be a source of motivation. So I recommend letting people do their own performance reviews along with the traditional performance reviews. So at the beginning of the month, you set out your goals, your performance goals and your learning goals. At the end of the month, you call yourself into the office and give yourself an evaluation. Where are you making progress? Where are you falling behind? If you look at high-performing teams in any sort of industry, high-performing teams always do this sort of thing. They collectively set out their goals, they give each other feedback, they try to get better. There's even some software out there, actually one of the, to help enrich the feedback environment. One of the top companies developing some new software is a company called Ripple, which is based in Toronto. And what they do is they have software that allows you, let's say we've worked on a project together, I can send out a note to everybody on the team, and they saying, hey, can you give me some feedback on how I did? And then they anonymously, using the software, can give you feedback. They don't have to if they don't want to. So it's just a way of intensifying that feedback cycle, because there's research out there that shows that making progress in your work is the single most motivating thing that people do on the job. And if we can give people richer, more rapid feedback, we can allow them to make progress, and that is inherently motivating.
Let me take your trinity, if I can put it that way: autonomy, mastery, purpose, and throw a couple of big names out there. Mark Zuckerberg, Mr. Facebook; Bill Gates, Mr. Microsoft. How would, I see the autonomy obviously in what they did, but how has mastery or purpose motivated the success that the two of them may have had over the years?
Yeah, I think actually Zuckerberg is a better case than Gates in many ways. I mean, if you look at Zuckerberg talk about Facebook, Zuckerberg had a chance. Zuckerberg's talking about Facebook and basically saying, we're going to change the way, in many ways, that people work and live. He's reconceived human relations in a way by saying there's this social graph of connections out there, and if you allow people to access it, they can do a little bit better. Remember, Zuckerberg has had plenty of chances to cash out over the last few years, and cash out at a level that is almost unimaginable to civilians like you and me, and yet he's resisted that because he wanted to have control over his company, and he wanted to do something that I think had some kind of impact on the world. So I think that he's a capitalist. There's no question about that. But I think that he has a sense that what he's doing is actually historically significant, and it's actually going to do something to improve people's lives a little bit more. I think that Gates was in some ways a more traditional kind of business person when he was running Microsoft. He's obviously not running it anymore. I think what's interesting, at least in my view, is that I'm convinced history will remember Bill Gates, as a philanthropist, not as a software guy. They'll remember him for his purpose-driven work, not for his ability to buy someone else's so-so piece of operating system software and distribute it widely in the world.
Interesting. Okay, in our last couple of minutes, let's focus on education. And I wonder how the research that you've developed here, how that might apply not necessarily to the workplace, but rather to the classroom.
Oh, sure. I think it has a big role in the classroom. For instance, if you think about just teachers, school teachers, both in the States and in Canada, have less autonomy than almost any other white-collar professional. And so I think if we give teachers a little bit more autonomy, students will learn better. If you ask people to describe the best teacher they ever had, you don't hear stories about compliance and rule following. You hear stories about high standards and independence. And so I think if we give teachers a little bit more autonomy, that will end up doing very, very well. One of the things, if you think about mastery, there's a big difference in the literature between what are called learning goals and what are called performance goals. Performance goals are getting a good mark on a test. Learning goals is actually learning something. And I think in many cases in our education policy and even in our schools, we've overemphasized these performance goals and underemphasized the learning goals. And so that say marks in school or grades have become not a form of feedback on how much somebody is learning, but the whole point of the exercise. And then the other thing is I think purpose in school is really, really important. I'm a father of 3. I see this with my own kids. When my daughter first started getting homework, back when she was about 6 years old, she was into it for a while, and then suddenly she starts asking me, okay, why am I doing this homework? I'm an enlightened guy, so I just said to her, hey, Sophia, be quiet and do your homework. But I realized that that's actually an important question, that if students don't know why they're doing what they're doing, they're not going to get particularly good at it.
Well, how's this for a follow-up, Dan? How's this for a follow-up? Sophia, yeah. I'll buy you an iPod if you finish your homework and get a good test score. Does that make sense?
Well, you know what? I mean, I know that you're joking, but believe me, that idea is out there. And things like paying kids for good grades or paying kids to read books. And you pay a kid to read books, and there are parents who do this. Let's say you pay a kid $2 to read a book, $2 for every book that they read. you can almost predict what's going to happen. They're going to read a lot in the short term. They're going to read short books, number one, and they're going to be into it for a while, but eventually it's going to lose its charm, and they're going to want $3 for a book or $4 for a book.
Well, they'll learn capitalism that way.
Well, I guess they can learn some negotiation skills. The downside is what they're learning is that reading is basically the equivalent of working at behind the counter at McDonald's or Tim Hortons, that it's something that only a chump would do for free. And I'm not sure that's the lesson that we want to give our kids.
Gotcha. Got to say, Dan, love the Canadian references. Really appreciated that, and it was a real pleasure to talk to you tonight. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, it's been a pleasure being on the program.
Dan Pink from Washington, D.C.